54 years of sanctions, President Obama declaring the Cold War with communist Cuba over. In Havana, they're celebrating, but some here are protesting the historic decision. We dive into the good, the bad, and the potential price for making nice with the Castros. Plus, the young and the hopeless, 1 in 5 millennials are now living in poverty. That's the most on record. Another F for Obamonomics. Is the lesson for millennials, stop voting for big government. And then, another faux story. First it was Rolling Stone's phony college rape case. Now it's New York Magazine's turn. The high school kid making millions in the stock market never made a dime. Our lazy journalists breaking the public's trust as America's watchdog. And not going to like this, liberals. Our Cashing In Person of the Year. Cashing In starts right now. Hi, everyone. I'm Eric Bolling. Welcome to Cashing In. Our Cashing In crew this week: Wayne Rogers, Jonathan Hoenig, Michelle Fields, and Jessica Ehrlich. Welcome, everybody. After decades as enemies, President Obama announcing plans for the U.S. to restore relations with communist Cuba. Americans on both sides of the aisle are divided over the move. Jonathan, when you take the emotion out of the equation, this could really be good for both economies, right?
Well, trade is good, Eric. It's mutually productive. And I think when the embargo, when these policies were enacted, Cuba was a military threat. They're no longer a military threat. So some change in policy, I think, is warranted. What's so disheartening is the manner in which the president did it. It's like he never misses an opportunity to denigrate America. So what does he say? You know, our policy hasn't worked. This all happened before I was born. The Pope told me to. We have to do it for the Cuban people. It just demeans America once again. And that's why I think the policy is a good idea. The manners, the ideas behind it are absolutely monstrous.
All right. Now, Jessica, you live in Florida. I think you ran for Congress in Florida. Huge Cuban population down there. What are your thoughts on this move?
Yeah, we actually have one of the oldest Cuban populations in the country here in Tampa. So it's been an issue for us, you know, for decades and decades. And I think it's actually really exciting and a wonderful thing to be able to finally get the concessions that they're having. The Red Cross is going to be in Cuba. They're finally going to have the UN human rights groups allowed back in Cuba to really see what the life is like for the Cuban people who've been there in this horrible regime. And hopefully with the expansion also of the internet, we'll be able to see not only increased trade and tourism with Florida and Cuba, but a better relationship.
I get all that, but here's my question. I listened to Marco Rubio this week saying he was against it. Why do you think Marco Rubio is against it?
Well, there's definitely a divide amongst, I think, even the Cuban population as to staying the hard line, no sort of change, no mercy until the regime comes down and the communists are out. And those who say, look, things haven't been working. We're not talking about China here. We're talking about Cuba. To sort of Jonathan's point, I mean, this isn't North Korea. This is Cuba, and they're our neighbor very closely. And if we can help the people that are really living there and struggling in poverty, get them internet access,
See, now you're getting off the range.
It becomes a democracy.
We don't need to help. We don't need to help anyone, Eric. Our policy should be that of ignoring. And by making a deal with them, we're sanctioning, we're legitimizing what still is a pretty bad dictatorship.
All right, hang in there. We can get to the dictatorship later. But Michelle, first of all, Michelle, hola, ¿cómo estás?
Bien, gracias.
Okay,
Look, I think this is a good thing.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think normalizing relations with Cuba is great. I think it's good. I think the best way to loosen the grip of a dictator is through free trade and travel. However, I don't think that this was a good deal. I think we should have told Cuba that if they wanted this deal, that they need to make some democratic concessions. They needed to make concessions with free elections. They needed freedom of the press and more freedom for everyday, ordinary citizens in Cuba. Because, look, if we allow tourists to start going into America, that's great for Cuba's economy. But the thing is a lot of these resorts, these hotels, these restaurants are owned by the Castro regime. So the money is not going to ordinary citizens. It's going to make the regime wealthier.
I want to talk about that in a second. I want to come back to you, Michelle, on that, because when we did this, it's actually going to help the Cuban peso, and that will help all Cubans, not just the Castro regime. It'll help the poor Cubans as well. Wayne, here's one thing, though. I came out in favor of this deal, and I got really kind of lit up on my friends on the right saying, I got 3 words for you, Bowling: Bay of Pigs. You want to take this? You remember that time, right?
Well, yes, unfortunately, I am the oldest one here, I think. So, no, I do remember the Bay of Pigs, and I remember all of that. But anytime you recognize a country, it's good for you. The reason it's good for you is you are able to establish a base within that country, and if we haven't been able to do that. When you have a consulate or you have an embassy somewhere, that allows you to get spies into behind the curtain, as it were. You can do all kinds of things.
We had an embassy in Libya.
Let me finish, please. Let me finish, Jonathan. You talk. Let me finish. So you've got to be able to do that. You've got to be able to have an access before you do anything else. Now, what you do of that access is very important. So we've got to wait and see.
And by the way, Wayne, in Spanish, you say shut up. You say cállate, por favor.
Eric, you mentioned the Bay of Pigs. You mentioned
That's
the Bay of
too nice of a
Pigs.
translation for Wayne.
Well, what about victory in the Pacific Day? I mean, I don't need Raul Castro bowing down on the deck of the USS Missouri, but what about an acknowledgement of past aggression and a promise from the U.S. that any aggression from Cuba will be met with not only sanctions but military force? I mean, our policies should be ignoring them. No embassy, no aid, no relations.
Hold on
this is a dictatorship.
That doesn't help you.
Wait, I know
Cut off your nose to spite your face.
Yeah,
that doesn't help you.
Exactly. We didn't do that with Japan dropped bombs on Pearl Harbor. China has human rights violations that far exceed what Cuba's doing, but we seem more than willing to trade with China. John?
Well, first of all, we won the war against Japan, and people who trade with China, people who trade with Venezuela, people who trade with not free economies, Eric, or even travel to them, they do it at their own risk. That's why our policy shouldn't be to bring freedom, to spread freedom.
But it's not just trade. We have factories. I mean,
go ahead,
there
Jess.
are factories in China. There are factories in China owned by American companies like Apple, like Nike, like Tommy Hilfiger. Everything is made in China, and yet they're one of the largest and worst communist regimes in the world, and we're having a serious argument about Cuba?
All right, I want to bring it back to Michelle. Michelle, lifting sanctions lifts the Cuban peso. That helps all Cubans, rich and poor.
It does, so long as it trickles down to ordinary Cubans, which is a question that only we'll find out when this happens. But look, I think this is a good thing because Castro has been using this for years, right? That the reason why Cuba is doing so poorly, their economy is so bad, is because of those evil Americans. So he no longer has that excuse. Right. Now he has no excuse for having a poor, awful country.
I got to get Wayne in here one more time, Johnny. I'm sorry. Wayne, final thought. We got to go. We're running out of time. Go ahead, Wayne.
Well, this is a good deal. As was said earlier, they're allowing in the Internet. They're going to allow human rights officials in there for years. For years, we didn't have that. And they have agreed to release 53 political prisoners that we, the United States, names. Or they're trying to do the best. I think when this comes out, this is all a positive thing. You can't prevent the free market system from ultimately erupting, and it's doing that, and it will do that more.
I'm going to leave it right there. I love that. And by the way, in Tampa, that little area called Ybor City, if you've never been there, a very heavy Cuban population. It's fantastic. Check it out. We're going to leave it right there. Our social media is unmatched anywhere in cable news. You are the most active group on social media. That means when you tweet or Facebook your thoughts and use our hashtag #CashItIn, your voice reaches literally millions. That also means you affect the national debate. I just tweeted this picture. Who came out on top? Who lost? Hashtag #CashItIn. Retweet that if you dare.